Welcome. I'm the Reverend Shane Montoya, and I'm glad you're here. I'm the interim pastor of the Wolcott Congregational Church, and welcome to another segment of our Together Apart worship series. As always, I invite you to, if you haven't already, to take a look down in the video description box and find the worship guide there, and some links to some YouTube videos with some wonderful music that should go well with this sermon. Today we are celebrating Trinity Sunday, that day when we celebrate the most uniquely Christian of doctrine, the Holy Trinity. Now, usually this is a day in which pastors try to use really bad metaphors to explain the Trinity, but I'm not going to subject you to that today. But today I'm going to give you a break. I won't spend today's video talking about endlessly complex metaphors for the Trinity. Instead, we're going to talk about something a little bit different, but that pops up in our readings. We're going to talk about the nature of power and authority, and how it should be exercised in a biblical sense. It acknowledges that any influence that we have over creation is a sacred trust from God. Indeed, I believe that if we are to talk about what authority means from a biblical perspective, I think we need to talk about it with three things in mind. First, that the authority that we have been given is not absolute. And secondly, that it is not meant for domination or violence, but rather the peace and security and justice and equality for all peoples. And lastly, we must also recognize that no authority that of human hands is eternal. And I know that some people interpret the Bible to have it say that our dominion over the earth is absolute and that we can do whatever we want with it. But I don't think that's true. Indeed, although Psalm 8 does say that we have dominion over the beasts and the seas and all those things that crawl under the seas, we know from other parts of the Bible that there are things in the seas that are unconquerable. Just last week, our psalm mentioned the Leviathan. We know from the book of Job that the Leviathan represents all that is untamable, all that man and humanity will not be able to control. The Leviathan represents not only itself, but all of those natural forces which are beyond the reach of humanity. Whether or not they're from the big things, the hurricanes, the tornadoes, the earthquakes, the floods, or the smallest things, viruses, bacteria, cancer. And perhaps it's because so much of our lives are controlled, are well controlled and well ordered, that we forget the wildness of nature, that we forget how much of our lives really aren't in our control. We should also note that in Psalm 8, there is no condition or no permission granted for authority and dominion over other human beings. I think this is an important one because often the Bible is held up as an example of supporting monarchy or even dictatorship in modern times. And I think a close reading of the Bible doesn't actually support that. First Samuel, of course, has the speech by Samuel upon the people of Israel wanting to elect a king, in which he outlines all of the bad things that kings do, that they take your money, that they will steal your sons off and force them to go to war, that they have egos, all of those sorts of things. And even the reigns of the two best kings, King David and Solomon, are not exactly shining and stellar examples of leadership. King David, we just need to talk about Bathsheba and Uriah, where he sends a man off to war to have him killed just so he can have a sexual relationship with his wife, that we would today call rape. Solomon, even though he is hailed as wise, isn't really much better. And the succession disputes that both men leave nearly tear their country apart. Monarchy just isn't that great in the Bible. There are a few exceptions, of course. King Hezekiah, as I've talked about before, delays the coming of the Babylonians and the destruction of the kingdom of Judah by about 25 years. But other than that, the list of really strong and powerful leaders is pretty thin. Instead, we might look to someone like the Judges. The Judges are, we don't talk about them much. I won't call them obscure. There's a whole book about them. But they're much more in the sense of lawgivers, and they allow people to do their own thing and they settle disputes rather than rule over people. So this brings us to the question of what a good biblical king would look like. How are we supposed to exercise authority according to the Bible? Luckily, we do have one really good example of what a ideal king would look like. And that's from the book of Isaiah in the second chapter of Isaiah. Now, this second chapter of Isaiah is often read in Advent. It's presaging Jesus. But we should also note that for the folks who were reading the Bible, it also had implications not just for the future Messiah, but also for a real life king that they hope to have one day, this ideal king. So let's read some of those words from that second chapter of Isaiah. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He shall judge between the nations, and shall arbitrate for many peoples. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more. Christian pacifists, peacemakers, and others in that tradition often look to this passage to tell them a little bit more about not just what a Christian king would look like, but what any leader would do, and what leaders should be devoted to doing, to making peace, preserving justice, those things which enable a society to thrive. The third thing to remember about authority as it's expressed and explained in the Bible is that it's temporary. It's not something that we like to think or talk about much in the Bible, but there's a lot of it, of scriptures, a lot of passages that talk about how fleeting everything is. These could be the famous lines in Ecclesiastes that talk about, there's a time and a season, a purpose for all things under heaven. Could be in the Gospel of Matthew, where the fields and the flowers fade. And this is the same thing is true with authority. Different regimes come into and out of power. In our own lives, the authority that parents have over their children is temporary. And often, children will have some authority in taking care of their adult parents, their elder parents. Now, primarily, the reason that we should believe in those things is because of Jesus, and that's what Jesus taught. But I think now we're also realizing that the world changes quickly. Who and what have power now might not soon enough. And we need to have mutual respect and care for each other in these circumstances. We don't know in our personal lives or in our wider lives what the future holds. I think it's better for us, Christian or non-Christian, to try and give each other compassion, to try to see the best in each other, to, in the words of Jesus, to tend to the beams in our own eyes instead of the specks in others. We do these things, we hope these things, primarily because, as I said before, Jesus tells us to. But also, I hope that there's a side effect from that. And that's the world that we leave in our wake, our legacies, as temporary as we are, as temporary as our legacies are, that the world we leave in our wake is perhaps one that has a little bit more compassion in it, one that has a little bit more care in it, one that has a little bit more kindness in it. And that, I hope, in this time of national division, is something that we can all agree on. Amen.